Good morning. Here we are ready, and I'm ready to start baking bread because it's kind of chilly in my house and I need some heat. So in order to make sourdough bread, I needed to do a second test. So we had tested the other day when we made shortbread cookies. I took some of it that was just had been fed and was eating it up, and I dropped it into water and it popped right to the top. That's our first step. So if it does that, that's great. Because sometimes when that will happen, but it doesn't mean it's ready. So you have to do a second step. So yesterday, and the second step takes longer. So yesterday I took that same sourdough, I cut it in half like we've been doing, and I added double what we would normally add. So it was about 70 grams worth of sourdough that ended up plopping into my bowl. And so I added 70 grams of water and I doubled it. So I added 140 grams of water and 140 grams of flour, stirred it together, put the top on it, and then waited because I needed it to double in size in 6 to 8 hours. So obviously it took all day for me to watch it, and it did. Yay, which means it's ready to cook bread. So when we're making sourdough bread, it's a little different than regular bread because we're using just that sourdough as my yeast. And I'm not adding the baker's yeast, which is what most people use nowadays, and baker's yeast happens faster, so you don't need to wait as long. But with sourdough, we have to give it more time. So one of the ways to help speed that up a little is we make what we call a sponge. So making the sponge basically means I take some of that sourdough and I add a lot of water and flour and a little bit of flour to it, and then I let it sit for at least 12 hours. And that activates that sourdough again, gets it being fed. So last night, because it takes 12 hours, I didn't want to wait 12 hours today. So last night before I went to bed, about 9:30, I took some of that sourdough and I added 4 times as much water and 6 times as much flour, stirred it all in, got it ready, covered it, and then I just let it sit. And when it has to sit for at least 12 hours. So it's been 10, 11 o'clock. So it's been 9:30, 10:30, 13 and a half hours. And what I ended up with is this. So you guys see that? And it's nice and bubbly, and it's more than doubled in size. And so we will now take this to make our bread. And it takes a while to make the bread, so I'm going to check in a little while I take this. I'm adding a bunch of flour to it. I don't need yeast. I'm going to take flour, and I'm going to add some salt, and I'm going to add some more water to make my dough. And then I will check in again so you guys can see that dough, because we have to knead it and get it into a right spot so then it can rise. So that is a little touch in to get my sponge. It's called a sponge. And then I'll take this and make my bread dough, but it takes a while to mix everything in, so I'm not going to make you sit and listen to all of that. I'm sorry, but I'm watching Weston walk around in my yard, so I want to make sure he doesn't leave the property. So I will see you guys in a little while. So I know I said I wouldn't check back in until I had the dough, but I wanted you guys to see what the sponge looks like. So here's my sponge. I deflated it, and you can see how it's kind of elasticy. Right? Isn't that kind of cool? And basically, instead of kneading it, and I'll show you what kneading is when we get the regular dough, we kind of just pull it and plop it back in, just to sort of get the gluten, which is in the flour, to get reactive and to start sticking together, because that's what we want. So you see how it's becoming a nice little ball? Because the more I do that, the more of a ball it will become. So it's just, I don't know. I think it's really, really cool to watch how the chemical reaction to everything that's going on happens. And it's just very neat to me, but this is something I enjoy, so that's why. And it's really kind of cool. And if I wanted to get my fingers all sticky and I stuck my fingers in it, it would stick right to it. But then as I pull away, it would just kind of pull and bounce right back off. So anyway, just wanted to show you this sponge and what it looks like. And then when I get the dough made, or stages of the dough, I will check back in and show you guys those different stages. Hi there. I wanted to give you guys a look. I've added the salt, more water, and some flour. And as you can see, It's starting to come together. See how it's kind of falling apart? And I'm going to mix it until a ball of dough starts to form. And then I'm going to knead it. Now, if I was going to knead it by hand, I would knead it for 7 or 8 minutes. But since I have this wonderful dough hook that attaches to my mixer, I don't have to do it by hand. I can do it using my machine. And as I've told all of you many times, we want to work smarter, not harder. And so if I didn't have the mixer, I could still make my bread. I would just have to work harder to do it. But since we have the mixer and it's available to us, I'm going to use it. So I'm going to continue to mix this together, knead it, and then I'll check back in and show you what the dough looks like right before we get ready to let it do its first rise. So I mixed all my flour in and I kneaded it, and you can see where it's starting to come together. And kneading it allows the gluten to really activate, and the gluten is what holds bread together. So this kind of bread, sourdough bread, is going to be a tacky. So when I'm putting my fingers on there, to see how it kind of sticks but comes off. So I'm going to take all of this lovely dough and I'm going to plop it into a bowl that I've put a little bit of oil all over it so that it won't stick to it. And we're going to stick it. I'm going to stick it in this bowl. And I'm going to let it do its first rise. So I want it to double in size. So it's going to pretty much fill this bowl once it's finished rising. And it's going to take 3, maybe even 4 hours to do so. It's going to take longer to rise because it's just the sourdough causing that activation. We don't have the other type of yeast which works a lot faster. So because of that, sourdough bread does take longer to make, but the flavor is so great. And it makes really good grilled cheese. So here we go. I'm going to let it sit. It's going to take about 3 hours. I'm going to go do some schoolwork, and then we'll be back. It has been about 4 hours since I last checked in, and our dough has risen. You can see it was way down here before, and it's almost filled our lovely bowl. I have my bread pans prepared. We're going to make 2 loaves. I've dusted them with a little bit of flour, because this dough is going to be a lot stickier, tackier than dough that we would use to make bread from with the baker's yeast that we use now, which makes a much lighter bread than sourdough bread will be. So even though this bread would be considered more of a sandwich loaf, so it's something you could cut and slice and make sandwiches with, which some sourdough bread is like round and has a real hard, tough crust and big, airy holes inside and very rich in flavor. This we're trying to get is a more sandwich loaf, so something more likely that you would buy in the store to make your sandwiches or toast or whatever. So basically, I'm going to dump this out, and you can see where it's kind of sticky. So I dusted my hands with some flour, and I've dusted my mat with flour as well. And we're going to just let this roll right out of my dish, my bowl. And it's going to look like a big mess, as it sort of is. So we're going to get some more flour. I'm going to dust it across the top. Get this stuff off my fingers. And then show you what a mess it is on my mat. But basically, I'm going to simply kind of roll it together and pick up some of that flour that is on my wrap tray, and then it kind of goes together nicely, see? And then I'm going to split it in half, and I forgot my So this is a great tool It helps with moving things. It also helps to cut big piles of dough like this so that I'm not trying to pinch it with my fingers. So I can simply push down in and get it split into two. And then I just kind of dust some more of that flour on there to keep it from getting too sticky. So here's my ball of dough, okay? And I'm just simply going to kind of gently roll it. And I don't know, there's a pocket already starting right there. So I'm going to kind of roll it, kind of shape it into a dough. It's not going to be something that's going to hold its shape because it is more loose than other type of bread dough. So, and then I'm going to simply put it in my pan. And what's going to happen in my pan is it's going to spread and fill my loaf pan. And that's what's going to give it that necessary shape that we're so used to having for our sandwiches. Bread that fits that kind of idea. And so again, my second piece, and it's okay if it's not a perfect, like each side, this one's a little stickier. If each section of dough isn't exactly the same size, so one loaf might be a little bit taller, but then I'll plop that in my second pan and just kind of make sure it's all shaped. And then, because this is what happens with bread, we have to let it rise again. So basically, I'm going to do the same thing I did before. I'm going to cover it. I'm going to stick it in a warm spot, and I'm going to let it rise. And it can take anywhere from 1 hour to 3 hours, depending on how strong our sourdough was to begin with, and ours was pretty strong, and how warm it is. So I'm actually going to stick it on the side of my wood cook stove. If you guys can see, here's my wood cook stove. Okay, and over where the fan is, that's the hot part, and over here is a much just warm part because the fire heats the whole top, but further away from the firebox is where it's warm, but it's not going to hurt. So I could go touch it and it wouldn't burn me or anything because it would just be warm. So that's where I'm going to put my bread dough and let it rise again, and then you will see me again to finish this video, but it'll be a couple hours, it'll be seconds for you. So it's been a while, but the bread rose as much as it's going to rise because it is sourdough. So this is about what it did. I cut it open so you can see how it's a lot denser than bread that we just buy in the store. Has a great smell though. And when we toast this, it makes a great crispy, crunchy outside, but still soft in the inside. So for our first batch with a brand new sourdough, this I consider a success. With more strength to our sourdough, so as it grows and gets older, this might become a little taller, a little higher. One never knows because it's wild yeast. It is something that you can't guarantee every single time, but that's part of what makes it fun. So there we go. You guys have watched sourdough starting from simply water and flour and then growing, and then by adding more water and flour and salt, we now made a lovely loaf of bread, which John and I are going to thoroughly enjoy. So now let's see, what can I tell you about next? You'll have to wait and see what I think of. Bye.